Unit 7 is the skeletal system. The first learning outcome of the skeletal system is define porosity and differentiate between cancellous and compact bone. Porosity is a measurement of the amount of pores or openings in something. To start off with an overall picture of the skeleton here, we tend to think of bones as being quite dense. If we were to look at the upper arm bone here, the humerus, and cross-section it, we would see that bone is actually quite porous. Specifically, at the end of the bone here, we have spongy bone tissue. You can see that there are quite a number of spaces in there, and the bone looks kind of spongy in character. And relative to that, we have compact bone that is a fair amount denser without the large pores that you see in the spongy bone. If we were to look at a cross-section of the bone, as is shown here by the square, we would see this. Even though the two types of bone, the spongy bone and compact bone, look different from each other, they are still porous. The spongy bone has quite large openings, a lattice-like framework with the hard bone connection points called the trabeculi, crossing over and connecting to each other within the spongy bone. However, the compact bone still has various canals and passageways within it. In the spongy bone, this structure allows for strength, but reducing the weight of the overall bone. In the compact bone, we still have these canals and passageways. They provide a space for nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatics to move through the compact bone. But then the compact bone is strong and resistant to crushing to help protect the bone. The structure of the compact bone is a little bit more organized than the spongy bone. As we said for the spongy bone, we have these trabeculi that are sort of the branches of bone that are then creating these spaces within that tissue. In the compact bone, we have these ring structures called the haversian system, or the osteon. Those rings are called the lamellae, and there are many lamellae that then circle around producing this haversian system, or osteon. Within the middle of the haversian system is the haversian canal, sometimes called the central canal. As you can see here, blood vessels, as well as lymphatic vessels and neurons, would run through these canals. And then we have the osteocytes, the bone cells. They're sitting within these little dark portions of the image that are called lacunae. The lacunae are connected to each other via the canaliculi. So as blood comes in carrying nutrients for the osteocytes within the bone, the nutrients will move from the blood vessels into the extracellular fluid that will then travel through the canaliculi and then reach the osteocytes in order to provide nutrients. Any waste produced by the osteocytes would again travel out into the extracellular fluid and then move through the canaliculi back to the haversian canal and into the blood vessels. As I stated earlier, the spongy bone is not as organized as the compact bone, but still the cells within the spongy bone would be able to receive nutrients via diffusion from the blood vessels that are around and get rid of waste back to those blood vessels also via diffusion. Before we get into more detail on the microscopic level, let's take a step back and differentiate between the different shapes of bones that we have in our body. So the first shape is long bone. A long bone is a bone that's longer than it is wide. Some examples include the humerus that we were just looking at, and then the other long bones within the arm, the ulna and radius, and the femur of the leg, as well as the tibia and fibula below the knee. Short bones are cube-shaped bones. Unlike the long bone, they're about as wide as they are deep as they are tall. They're mostly spongy bone. Bones of the wrist and the bones of the ankle are short bones. We also have flat bones. These are thin and flattened, usually curved, as in the flat bones of the skull. They're two thin layers of compact bone with spongy bone sandwiched between them. The sternum is also an example of a flat bone. A sesamoid bone is a small bone often found in tendons adjacent to where joints and tendons undergo compression. And the patella, your kneecap, is an example of one. They're sesamoid because that shape is related to sesame seeds. It comes from the same Latin root word, and you can see here the shape of the patella is like a sesame seed, wide at one end and then narrow at the other. Finally, we have irregular bones. Really, an irregular bone is any bone that does not fit the above criteria, like the vertebrae here. It's irregular, you have all kinds of processes and divots and so on within the bone such that it has an irregular shape. Let's focus on the structure of a long bone. So here we are looking at the bone that we saw earlier in the course. What are the various portions of the bone? We already mentioned the spongy bone at the end of the long bone and the compact bone around the shaft of the bone. But what are the definitions for those portions of the bone? Epiphysis is the end of a long bone. So we have two ends of the long bone here surrounding the diaphysis, the shaft of the long bone. The diaphysis is mostly compact bone, and then within it we have a cavity as well. But on either end, as we mentioned, we have the epiphyses, which is mostly spongy bone. However, around that spongy bone, we also have a thin layer of compact bone. Within the epiphyses, we have the epiphyseal disc. This is a cartilage area or line present at the junction of the diaphysis and the epiphysis. This is the area where growth occurs as we grow up and our bones lengthen. When our bones reach their full length, then that epiphyseal disc goes from being cartilage to being compact bone. Some other parts of the long bone include the articular cartilage. Articular is a term for joint. And so at either end of this long bone is a joint that connects it to other bones. Articular cartilage is cartilage that covers the end of the bone at the joint and helps to cushion the joint. It absorbs stress as the two bones are potentially bumping into each other during movements of the skeleton. Now you might be saying to yourself, when we discuss cartilage in tissues, articular cartilage was not one of the types of tissues that was discussed when we talked about cartilage. That's because the articular in articular cartilage is talking about the location. It's referring to the joint, as I just mentioned. The type of cartilage that is found in articular cartilage as a tissue is hyaline cartilage, as discussed in the unit on tissues. Looking back at the spongy bone in the epiphysis, the spaces that we mentioned before within the spongy bone are not empty within the bone. There's actually red bone marrow within those cavities. And we'll come back and look at the function of the red bone marrow in a minute here. Within the diaphysis, we have a cavity here that is surrounded by the endosteum. Endo meaning inside and osteum meaning bone. It's a smooth lining within the cavity shown here. Within that cavity, which is called the medullary cavity as is named here, we have the yellow bone marrow. Again, we'll come back to the function of the yellow bone marrow in just a moment. The periosteum surrounds the entire bone, peri for perimeter and osteum for bone. It covers all surfaces of the bone not covered by articular cartilage. It's a tough, fibrous connective tissue, and it's vascular with blood vessels and is firmly attached to the underlying tissue within the bone. Not only is it a tough fibrous connective tissue, but it is also continuous with ligaments and tendons that we'll look at once we get to joints and how muscles move the bone. It's important though to understand that it is continuous with these two tissues, the ligaments and the tendons, because this is how we have strong attachments via ligaments from bone to another bone and via tendons from bone to muscle. So as I mentioned earlier, we would come back to differentiate between red and yellow bone marrow with respect to the function and the location. So red marrow is found within spongy bone, specifically within the spongy bone found in the epiphyses of the long bone. So as much as we have not cross-sectioned the lower epiphysis that's shown in this picture, it would also contain spongy bone with red bone marrow being found within the cavities in that spongy bone. In addition to red bone marrow being found in the spongy bone of long bones, short bones are also made up mostly of spongy bone. Within the cavities within that spongy bone, you also find red bone marrow. Red bone marrow functions in blood cell formation. This is where the blood cells of our body are actually produced. Within the medullary cavity, as we stated, it's not actually empty, but there's yellow bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is actually yellow because it's involved in fat storage. So the yellow color to it is because fat has a slightly yellow color to it. So this is another area in our body where we can actually store fat to be used for energy later. And on top of that, it makes it so that these bones are not extra heavy. If the bone was solid throughout the diaphysis here, instead of having the medullary cavity, our bones would be quite a bit heavier, and our skeletal system overall would be that much heavier to move around. So, what are the three types of blood cells that are produced within the red bone marrow? The first are red blood cells, sometimes shortened to RBC, the scientific term for them being erythrocytes. These are involved in the transport of oxygen and to some extent carbon dioxide within the blood. The second are white blood cells, sometimes shortened to WBC, the scientific term for them being leukocytes. These are involved in our immune system responses. And then finally, platelets, the scientific term being thrombocytes, that are involved in blood clotting. Let's move on to the function of bone. Overall, our skeletal system and our bones have various functions. The first is support. Our bones act as the steel girders of our body, as in a building has many steel girders within it holding the overall building up. In our body, it's bones that provide this support. They provide a structure, an internal framework that is held together to give us that support. The bones of the limbs, the pelvis, and the vertebrae help support the body and hold it up. Movement. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones via tendons, as mentioned earlier. The bones act as levers to allow the body to move, or parts of the body to move. In addition to that, the muscles, along with the bones, provide support. While the bones provide the structure, the muscles attach to them to hold them in place. Protection. The bones of our skull, our rib cage, and our pelvis provide protection to the soft body organs found within them. Storage. We've already mentioned that the medullary cavity stores fat in the yellow marrow. On top of that, the bones provide a storehouse for calcium and phosphorus within the matrix of the bone. Blood plasma calcium levels must be maintained within the homeostatic range in order for muscle contraction, nerve impulse conduction, blood clotting, and heart action to function properly. And finally, blood cell production, as we mentioned in terms of the red bone marrow. This production is called hematopoiesis. This forms the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, as we mentioned earlier. So let's discuss the storage of the calcium and phosphate, specifically the calcium within the bone, and its relationship between the osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and then serum or blood plasma calcium levels. We looked at this image before of all the various parts of the long bone, the spongy bone, and the compact bone, and discussed the osteocytes found within the lacunae of the compact bone. We only mentioned the osteocyte. These are mature bone cells found within those lacunae as the bone goes along functioning. But there are two other types of cells that we should mention: osteoblasts, which are cells that are involved in the building of that calcium phosphate matrix. The third type of cell is the osteoclasts, which is the type of cell that will break down that matrix. Osteoblasts will build the matrix by taking calcium out of the blood and putting it into the matrix of the bone. Osteoclasts will break down the matrix of the bone, releasing calcium into the blood. To look at this in a different way, and to discuss a little bit about the hormonal regulation of this, let's imagine we have high blood calcium levels. What will happen is the thyroid will sense that, and then the thyroid will release the hormone calcitonin. The calcitonin secretions, as they increase, will go to the osteoblasts found within the bone, and it will cause those osteoblasts to build up the bone matrix. As the bone matrix is being built up, the calcium levels decrease because calcium is taken out of the blood and put into the bone matrix. In the opposite case, if we have low blood calcium levels, the parathyroid senses that and begins to release the parathyroid hormone. As the parathyroid hormone levels increase, They go to the osteoclast of the bone and tell the osteoclast to break down the bone matrix. As the osteoclasts break down the bone matrix, they release the calcium from the matrix out into the blood, bringing those calcium levels of the blood back up. Overall, this is a feedback loop, specifically a negative feedback loop, where if high blood calcium levels exist, then there's a response to decrease those levels. And vice versa, if low blood calcium levels exist, there is a response in the body to increase those levels.